As a developed nation, our water infrastructure is relatively comprehensive, and most of us have expectations of ready access to water that we need to live. Yet the huge wealth disparities in the United States mean that our nation's water issues are often hidden. As we know from recent water crises in Flint, Michigan, and Jackson, Mississippi, on some of the reservations, especially during COVID, and elsewhere, we just can't take water for granted. The presenters today approach this work from the perspective of human rights, the human right to water, and the human right to government information. Under human rights law, the right to water entitles everyone to have access to sufficient, safe, acceptable, physically accessible, and affordable water for personal and domestic use. Today, we're going to be focusing on the affordability piece of that, water affordability, and underscoring the fact that many people in the United States live with unstable access to water because of increased costs that are exacerbated by inefficient, even antiquated systems for setting water rates and for assessing customer assistance plans. The difficulty of obtaining information about water policies compounds these issues and is itself an additional human rights issue. So I'll introduce the speakers now, we'll start going through the program. First, we'll hear from Dr. Kaylee Ward. Dr. Ward is an environmental sociologist who teaches at Northeastern University in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and in the Department of Health Sciences. Primarily, she's involved in investigating issues of water access, water shutoffs, water liens, and the quality of customer assistance programs in Massachusetts and beyond. Then we'll hear from Noelle Gulick, a research associate and soon to be graduated law student with Northeastern Law School's program on human rights and the global economy. She'll give a rundown of pending legislation in Massachusetts that could be a model for other jurisdictions as a first step to address water affordability issues, providing both customers and utilities with information that they need to improve their systems. I'll then take up the mantle and briefly describe the national picture in terms of water policy reporting laws. And then I'll turn to Dr. Laura Senior to moderate a Q&A following the presentations. Dr. Senior is an associate professor of sociology and health sciences at Northeastern University with research interests including the sociology of medicine and public health, community environmental health, and environmental justice. And she has been a leader in developing our team's research on water affordability. So as we go along, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A and we will turn to them at the end of the presentation. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Ward. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Martha. As Marge mentioned, I'm going to be giving us sort of a background on this water justice issue related to water unaffordability to get us all familiar with this topic. And I'll be providing us two different case studies as examples of issues with data justice related to water unaffordability. Noelle, if I could have the next slide. Perfect. So today our discussions are really oriented around the question of for whom is water fairly priced and how do we determine that? How do we provide solutions to making water more affordable? For those of you unfamiliar with this topic, water unaffordability has been a growing issue in the United States over the past decade or so, but this issue has been growing over many, many decades. In particular, this problem disproportionately affects low-income households and minority households in the United States, so they have higher rates of water poverty. To give you an understanding of how severe this issue is, if we look at current projected rates of how much water bills will increase, right now it's projected that this will triple. So from about 12% of US households dealing with an unaffordable water bill to being almost 36% of all US households. This means we could have 1/3 of households in the United States dealing with some level of water poverty. Now, currently, on average, if we're looking across states, 12 to 17% of US households currently struggle to pay their water bills. This is already quite a deep and concerning problem. The next slide, please, Noelle. So in order to understand how we got to this place where we might be facing a state where 1/3 of the United States is dealing with water poverty to some extent, there are 4 key components I would like us to go over that contribute to this ramping up of clean water costs. Now, I want to just make sure it's clear that these components should not be viewed in isolation or as mutually exclusive from each other. These sort of compound upon each other, making water unaffordability more severe. So As you may be familiar with, water utilities must comply with federal regulations as administered through the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA. Two laws that you might think about on this topic are the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act that help maintain our drinking water. Since the 1970s, though, the federal funding provided to utilities or to assist with maintaining our water infrastructure has been limited. So since the 1970s, utilities have had less financial assistance from the federal government in order to maintain our water infrastructure. That means then that utilities have had to finance increasingly expensive water treatment plants, replacing of pipes and meters, and those sorts of things on their own. So that means there are increasing fixed costs for these utilities. And by fixed costs, I mean operational costs and maintenance costs. So for example, maintenance costs would be trying to repair or maintain our aging water infrastructure that we've been dealing with since the 1970s, whereas increased operational costs include things like having to retrofit water treatment plants to deal with emerging contaminants such as PFAS or microplastics, or things that impact our ability to have clean water available to people in the United States. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about increasing fixed costs. Now, of course, we're not just dealing with financial troubles, we are also dealing with very complex local realities that are unique to each utility and vary from state to state. So there are complex local, ecological, social, and economic phenomena that we have to consider when looking at why water is not affordably priced. So for example, we have the effects of climate change, we have worsening weather events or more severe weather events such as prolonged drought that affects water supply. We also have to consider that we have more extreme rain events, so exacerbated issues with flooding that might impact storm or wastewater systems, cause damage, or otherwise affect treatment plants. Then we have local effects of differing rates of relative poverty across cities. We also might consider the fact that some utilities may have more financial support from their local government or state government than others would. So taken as a whole, this is why we see this ramping up of clean water costs in the United States over time. Next page, Noel. Okay. Another way to think about this is a balancing act between two buckets. So on the left, we have human needs. These are things like clean water, accessible water, and affordable water. And on the right, we have considerations for the responsibilities and burdens that utilities have. This is not an exhaustive, list, but it provides some of these. So having to comply with state policies or regulatory mandates, and also contending with issues like limited funding. So whenever we're looking at this problem of water unaffordability, what we're actually looking at is how do we balance these differing needs? Next slide, Noel. So at this point, you might be wondering, okay, we have increasing water rates. What happens then if someone cannot pay their bill? Typically, what will happen is a utility will do two different things. They might employ what we call a cost recovery policy, which is essentially a financial penalty to incentivize the customer to pay their arrears or pay their debt. So when I mean cost recovery, I mean the utility is trying to recover lost revenue, lost funds from customers. So they might use really severe penalties, such as shutting off water or doing a property lien, or they might use less severe penalties, such as a late payment fee, doing interest on debt or arrearage. You might have reconnection fees or deposits that were required. So if someone has their water turned back on, utilities usually charge for that service, and that can range from $25 to over $100, depending on the utility and the place. And then, of course, we'll have general fines and fees that vary from utility to utility. Is this to say there's a lot of variability in the types of cost recovery policies utilities use and how frequently they use them? On the flip side, utilities may provide customer assistance programs or means by which to help customers financially or to help them just manage their debt. So I've listed here some of the common discounts we see or other things that we see, such as providing assistance to those who are elderly or senior, people who are low income, people who may be experiencing a disability. So we see discounts there or other forms of assistance provided to those customers. And I've listed here on the right how common or uncommon these types of programs are. On the other hand, you might have something like payment plans, which I want to highlight because these are typically very common for utilities, even though there's lots of variability amongst utilities, where they simply just help the customer figure out how they're going to pay a bill over 3 or 4 months and work with them on paying that bill. And then you might see other things like debt forgiveness or tiered income rates. Tiered income rates or block rates are sort of the gold standard for when we're looking at making water affordable. This is where customers are not charged by the amount of water they use. Rather, their water bill is capped based on their income bracket. So when you have tiered income rates, this guarantees that your water bill is not more than 2.5% of your total income. Or if your bill includes sewer, not more than 4.5% of your income. And then for those of you interested in this sort of topic, I've provided here some examples of this tiered income-based discount, which is from Detroit, the Lifeline Plan, and then also Philadelphia's TAP program. Next slide, Noel. Okay, so I've kind of given us some background information, the history about water and affordability, how sort of utilities handle water and affordability for their customers and how they might try and recover costs. But the other big elephant in the room is that we have really poor data with which to try and understand the impacts of water unaffordability. So currently speaking, there's not a federal law that requires utilities to gather or make public data that would allow utilities and policymakers to determine which groups their water pricing policies affect. Typically, we have to do this through other means and measures rather than getting it from the utility itself. This also means, because there's not a law that requires them to collect this data, that there's no way for utilities or advocates to determine which groups are struggling to pay these bills. So this includes groups like elderly, the disabled, or low-income ratepayers. This also means it's hard for us to evaluate how well a utility provides assistance, if they're actually using resources effectively, if it's actually accomplishing what they hope those targeted resources are accomplishing, and essentially means we have difficulty evaluating the efficacy of these customer assistance programs. It also means utilities themselves have a hard time self-evaluating. So in order to elucidate on this, we're going to go over 2 recent evidence-based research projects. The first one is looking at a comparative study between utilities in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, which was funded by the National Science Foundation. And then the second case is an ongoing research project that's looking at utilities at a national level. Next slide, Noel. Okay, perfect. So bear with me. I know there's a lot of things on this slide, but I'd like us to pay attention to the sample first on the left. So very briefly, this study was a comparative study between utilities that we selected in Pennsylvania and utilities that we selected in Massachusetts. All of these were publicly owned utilities. We matched these utilities based on the relative poverty level of the city and the size of the city, as well as other demographical characteristics. We interviewed 37 people within these utilities, including utility staff and those outside the utilities, such as rate consultants and other advocates who were interested in dealing with water unaffordability. Beyond our qualitative data collection with interviews, we also tried or attempted to get billing information from these utilities by using Freedom of Information law requests. In those FOIL requests, we asked for information on how many shutoffs, how many liens they had between 2015 and 2018, and we also asked for other information related to their assistance programs, for example. So that's sort of the sample in the context of that. As for key takeaways as it deals with data, no utility except for Pittsburgh was able to provide complete information regarding shutoffs, liens, and types of customer assistance. And when I say customer assistance, what I mean is the type of discount, the amount of financial relief that might be tied to that discount, and then also the number of people who actually received or were enrolled in that discount or that program, for example. So this means that regardless if we were getting things through FOIL requests or we were asking in follow-up interviews, people would use very general language or sort of gray language when describing these numerical values, such as, I think it's about 50 people, or we think it's about 120, or the limit of the amount of funds someone can receive in a year, I think, is $200. So people were not very clear about both shutoffs and liens and, of course, the assistance programs themselves. This highlights that there are issues with tracking, identification, and just maintaining general billing records or just general customer information across these utilities. Similarly, staff within these utilities who are dealing with customers in crisis or are otherwise responsible for things within the billing department are frustrated with old software or software that's not really suitable for dealing with their customer base. So this includes other things like IT and IS infrastructure being undersized for the amount of people they are servicing. It also means it's difficult for them to track who is eligible for a certain program. It's also hard for them to track like who is delinquent on their bills. Now, this frustration wasn't just expressed by the utility staff we had in our sample. We had people outside the utility who, work in this water space who also shared similar views. So rate consultants espoused very commonly that utilities have poor data management, which makes it harder for them to do their own jobs in providing rate recommendations. And as for advocates, similarly, because this data is largely inaccessible or the utility doesn't have this data, it's hard for advocates to then see behind essentially the wall and see what's going on within the utility. So regardless if we're talking about staff, consultants, or advocates, there's a general understanding that there's an issue with data management in utilities and maintaining billing information in utilities. What this means for us or people concerned about water unaffordability is that utilities are creating assistance programs without being able to assess if they are targeting effectively. However, this is not to say everything is doom and gloom and there's nothing to be done in this space. We found that our high poverty utilities or utilities serving high poverty cities, they were much better at providing caps. And by that, we found a lot of innovation within high poverty utilities. They were more likely to try and provide more diverse programs, increase the amount of financial assistance, try to attempt better outreach, try to enroll people who are eligible but weren't currently enrolled. And this is, despite the fact that these high poverty utilities have fewer resources, maybe less personnel, but they also have much higher debt than a utility that is serving a low poverty area and doesn't have to concern themselves so much with financing things. With that, we're going to move on to case 2. So as I mentioned before, this is in progress research. And in this study, we're essentially pulling back. We're not looking at the state level. We're trying to look at the national level. And we have pulled a representative sample of water utilities across the 50 contiguous states. So that means we're excluding territories and tribal lands. Right now, we have about 377 utilities we are assessing. That number might change a little bit once we confirm that utilities haven't combined or changed names or those sorts of things. We got this original list from the EPA from a study they did in April of 2016, where they went through all of these utilities and sort of assessed their programs. What we wanted to do was look at how these utilities existed in 2016 and then compare how they exist today in 2024. And that was looking at essentially types of assistance they were offering. How do they enroll people or how do they determine eligibility? Do they do that internally or do they do that externally? The amount of relief they provide to customers, how they fund these programs, and then of course, we're concerned about who is experiencing this problem. So we included, what do these programs target? Is it elderly folks? Is it disabled folks? Is it low-income households? So on and so on. Beyond that, we also looked at the Low-Income Household Assistance Program, LIHWAP. For those of you familiar with LIHWAP, this was created by the Biden administration following the events of the pandemic, where water bills became increasingly problematic, and it was made to provide some assistance to people experiencing that crisis in 2021. So we looked at data in the fiscal year of 2023. So first I want to go over some preliminary takeaways for utilities, and then we'll look at LIHWAP itself. So across these 9 fiscal years, across the same set of utilities, we've seen very little development around assistance, generally speaking at the national level. Notably, again, looking at that data piece, utilities typically do not handle enrollment and eligibility internally. By that, I mean if I'm a utility and a resident comes to me, my customer comes to me and says, I'm having a problem paying my bill, instead of the utility saying, okay, great, fill out this form and get back to us, they will actually tell them, oh, please go over to this other organization or vendor, fill out their form, go through their eligibility and enrollment process, and then we'll come back to this. So there's a lot of externalization of handling enrollment, or decentralization, essentially, of this process, which indicates there's some sort of problem with utilities themselves maintaining this data or doing this enrollment themselves. Unfortunately, when we look at these utilities over time, we do see very few utilities adopting low-income based discounts despite rising need, despite that context of we prospectively might have 1/3 of US households dealing with an unaffordable water bill in the near future. As for LIHWAP, I don't want to spend too much time talking about how much money states received or the types of assistance that LIHWAP provided to low-income households, such as reducing a water bill or turning water back on after a shutoff. Really want to focus on looking at information and data. So even though LIHWAP provides a lot of assistance that has been absent, historically speaking, there's still problems with actually looking at the information LIHWAP is providing us about who is experiencing unaffordability. So the way LIHWAP works is you apply in a particular quarter. There's 4 quarters in a fiscal year. If you apply in quarter 1, but you receive assistance in quarter 3, a utility is told not to count that person until quarter 3. What that means is we do not know if there's a very large lag in someone receiving assistance or if people receive assistance very quickly. The second thing is that household data is still missing within LIHWAP. We are missing racial data, income data, other characteristics and components of populations that would help us understand better who water and affordability is directly impacting. More importantly, because this is state level data and utilities report to LIHWAP and then LIHWAP generates state information for people to look at on their publicly accessible website, it means we can't see differences from utility to utility, which is really important because there's high variability in the types of cost recovery policies that utilities use and the types of customer assistance programs they offer. By this, I mean, let's say we have a hypothetical state. This state has 5 utilities in it. The state is given a certain amount of money, let's say just 10 million, and then that gets passed out to the utilities. Let's say the first utility out of the 5 uses like 80 to 90% of their allotted funds, whereas the other 4 utilities maybe use 50% of their allotted funds. If we were able to see that type of data, we would be able to identify and determine that utility 1 is dealing with some sort of crisis and is in need of assistance. So beyond just looking at customers in crisis, having this type of data would also let us evaluate utilities in crisis in particular. And by that, I mean we'd be able to identify high use utilities, those that use much more of this federal funding, or high need utilities. So with that, I'm actually going to transfer over to Noelle to talk a little bit more about the legal aspect of this and a bill currently going through the Massachusetts legislature.
All right. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about some pending legislation in Massachusetts right now. So this is just the first page of the bill. It's in both the House and the Senate right now in Massachusetts, and the bill is titled An Act Advancing Water Access Equity Through Utility Reporting Requirement. So like I said, it's currently before both the House and the Senate in the Ways and Means Committee. I'm just going to give some background about what the bill does and why there is a need for it in Massachusetts. So right now, there's no requirement that water utilities in the state track and publish the number of things like water shutoffs, shutoff notices, and other information like that is necessary to provide water justice. So without this and other related water utility data, it's very difficult to address any inequities or inadequacies in the state's support for the human right to water, because there's no way to tell who is having their water shut off or things like that. So this bill will require public and private water utilities to file quarterly reports, and they'll have to document critical data such as the total number of customers they've served, the number of water shutoffs due to people not paying, the number of liens sought for non-payment, and the availability and use of customer assistance programs, and also the number of customers that were charged fees for things like service reconnection or late payments. And this data will be organized by zip code and then made available to the public. So the idea is that by having this data and seeing where, the certain disparities lie, then we would be able to address that need and see where certain people need more assistance with water access. So in Massachusetts, both renters and homeowners have experienced the financial burden of rising water costs. So if residents are experiencing issues with paying their water bill, there's currently no statewide program that would give them water assistance to either low-income renters or homeowners. And so what happens sometimes is a outstanding water bill can be converted into a tax lien, which is then added to the customer's real estate tax bill. And if this remains unpaid, the interest can compound rapidly until the homeowner might be at risk of losing their property. So there have been preliminary studies that should suggest that those facing the highest rates of water shutoffs are some of the most underserved communities, including poor households and Black and Brown communities. So the ultimate goal of this bill is transparency because it's impossible to address the inequities with something where there's no data for it. And with the adequate data, policymakers would be able to target their policies or sort of be able to document and remedy any suspected bias in the implementation of their water plans. And so this bill is just an essential step in determining the number of Massachusetts residents who have lost or are at risk of losing access to household water and things like that. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about its path through legislation so far. So it started in the Joint Committee on Environment and Natural Resources. And actually last September, there was a hearing before this committee where some people from PHRGE spoke and other advocates spoke about just sort of what the bill does. And then in February of this year, the bill was favorably voted out of the Joint Committee on Environment and Natural Resources, which was a very big step in getting support for the bill. And that's sort of like the first step in moving it forward. So right now, the bill is pending a reading before the Committee on Ways and Means in both the House and the Senate. And on the screen here, you can see the legislators who have petitioned for the adoption of this bill. So just sort of people who are supporting. So there's quite a few people in the House and then some people in the Senate as well. And then also PHRGE has worked to get several organizations to support the bill. So there are several groups that have endorsed it. I'll just read off a few right now. But it's the Conservation Law Foundation, the Natural Resources Defense Council, Green Roots Incorporated, the Northeastern Environmental Law Society, Lawyers for Civil Rights, Massachusetts Law Reform Institute, Sierra Club in Massachusetts, the National Consumer Law Center, the Tenant Advocacy Project at Harvard, Unitarian Universalist Mass Action, the Central Massachusetts Agency on Aging. And then, like I said, the other supporters of the bills in the legislature are listed here on this screen. So there's quite a few groups who have supported this, which has been really great in trying to move it forward. And in terms of next steps of what we're sort of thinking with advocacy in order to push this forward, hopefully Ways and Means in both the House and the Senate will report it out favorably. But after that, there are still more readings that have to happen. There are still more committee readings and considerations that they will make to the bill. And we will be trying to continue to work to make sure it receives favorable consideration throughout, through different advocacy efforts. And yeah, our immediate goal is making sure it's reported favorably out of Ways and Means in both House and Senate. And I'm gonna pass it to Professor Davis, who's gonna talk about similar legislation in other states.
Yes, thank you, Noelle. So I'm going to talk about what other states are doing. Before that, I'm just going to add on to what Noelle mentioned about the prior studies that suggest that there is a disparate impact on the basis of race on some of the ways in which water policies are implemented. And not only was there a study some years ago from a group called The Color of Water that suggested a disparate racial impact in decision-making about shutoffs, but more recently, the State Advisory Committee of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission did a related study that indicated that there was some racial disparity in the implementation of these policies, which could well be unconscious, but the problem is that right now, without any data, it's very difficult. Without data that isn't, collected in a sort of extraordinary way by dogged researchers, it's very difficult to know and impossible for utilities themselves to know whether or not some of that unconscious bias is affecting their implementation of their policies. So what are other states doing? Because this is a nationwide issue, and we want to show what's going on elsewhere around the U.S. State governments have realized that the lack of information about water policies and implementation is a real issue that affects their constituents. So California was the first state to act on this. They, in 2019, passed the California Water Shutoff Protection Plan that, as it says here, requires urban and community water systems to report the number of annual discontinuations of residential services for failure to pay. And the implementation of that was, of course, stymied to some extent by COVID, because it was enacted shortly before that. But it is now an ongoing program. And in addition to the statutory requirement, there's also been some additional administrative actions to require utilities to report in California. Illinois in 2021 enacted a water utility reporting law for investor-owned water utilities, which in Illinois and also in Massachusetts and many other states really make up a pretty small percentage of the number of utilities in the state, but it's a start. As a practical matter, investor-owned utilities, because they're not government run, sometimes it's more difficult to get data from them. They're not subject to FOIL, to the Freedom of Information Law. And so having a reporting requirement for them may be particularly important given that, even though it's a small number of people that are affected by or that are serviced by private utilities. And so the Illinois law, pretty complete, in terms of the data points that they're asking for from the investor-owned water utilities, organized by zip code so that there's a possibility of assessing disparate impact based on race, based on other demographic data. And this is an ongoing reporting requirement that is in place in Illinois now. New Jersey, the following year in 2022, enacted an even more comprehensive bill, which applies to all water utilities, not just the investor-owned, and also at the zip code level. And listing a lot of affordability metrics. And one thing that's unique and important about the New Jersey bill is that not only are these quarterly reports published, but that there's also the Board of Utilities is assessing whether the existing assistance programs meet the needs of customers who've fallen behind. So that's really what the goal of this is. And here in New Jersey, we've got a statutory obligation framed around using this data to try to ensure that customer assistance plans are properly targeted and are making the difference that we want them to make. And then finally, I'll mention Maryland, where there's a pending bill, pending legislation that would do something more than what other states have done in creating an open water data reporting platform to provide broad public access in real time to information on shutoffs and other indicia of water affordability. So really a one-stop shop on access to this information. That bill in Maryland is more or less at the same stage that our Massachusetts bill is. It's gone from out of one committee and is pending in another committee for legislative consideration. So as you can see, there's growing recognition, in other states and around the country of this issue, but not, it's still growing. So Massachusetts has the opportunity to join this vanguard of states that have then the data necessary to address affordability in a sustainable, informed way. and to really create a model that other states can follow and show how this can, help utilities in terms of making their processes more efficient as well as helping consumers. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Senior, who will moderate the question and answer. And if folks online have additional questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so very much to all three of our presenters for giving us such a multifaceted appreciation of this problem. Noelle, I think we can probably take the chat or the screen share down so that we can open this up during Q&A. And there are a few questions in the chat, but I guess I'll just start by asking if anyone online has questions that you want to chime in on. You can raise your hand, and I'd be happy to welcome you in. Okay, hearing none. I will turn to one of the questions that was submitted in the online portal. Is there a right to water under US law? And I think that I'll invite either Noelle or Professor Davis to chime in on this, because I think that's a very complicated situation in terms of federal versus state jurisdictions.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and field that. Thank you. There is no right to water under federal law. The U.S. Constitution is a constitution that is expresses limitations on government and doesn't provide a lot of good things that we might want, like no right to housing, no right to food. And so those sort of economic social rights are typically left to state constitutions if they're present at all. I will say that under federal law, there is a lot of regulation of water quality. But not regulation of water affordability directly, and not any sort of right to water directly under federal law. At the state level, there are a few state constitutions that seem to articulate a right to water. There hasn't been litigation under that, but there's at least text that suggests that there is a right to water that sometime in the future might be enforceable. As we've been talking about, most of the regulation of water utilities happens at the state level or even at the local level. And again, water quality is a major focus, much less so than water affordability. And so the rate making and so on happens at the utility level typically. So it's a very fragmented system. And that would be one of the reasons that this kind of data is so important, because every community has different needs and may have different ways of accessing water, but it's so fragmented that we're not able to sort of make sure that some of our other public policy values, like lack of discrimination, like making sure that people have access to water, are really addressed. We just can't do that without trying to get some of this more granular data. Mm-hmm. I think that answers the question. Right.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Other questions from folks in the room? Anybody who wants to chime in can raise their hand. Sandia from Legal Defense Fund. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all so much for this really excellent presentation. I just put a question in the chat, but I can say it out loud. My question was that it sounds like, from what I understand, most of the new laws that require water utility reporting require the reporting at the zip code level. And I'm wondering if any of the existing laws or pending laws require reporting of individual level demographic data that would allow for analyses of disparities by race and by income and other individual level demographics.
I can speak to that too. So right now there are no laws either pending or enacted that go beyond zip code, and some of them don't require zip code. I don't believe California's did. I'm not sure about that, but there has been some discussion. There was some discussion as the Massachusetts law is pending about whether or not an alternative would to individual level would be, or zip code level would be census tract, and that might be a more usable metric for assessing disparities. I think that there are privacy issues with the sort of individualized level. That these are individual people that live in particular places that have maybe have financial issues or others and so on. And so making that kind of information public in that way would be, probably violate some privacy laws. But if you're talking about census tract or something that's a more aggregated set of data, but that still allows you to look for disparities, that's the kind of, I think, gold standard kind of issue that measurement that we'd be looking for. Dr. Senior, did you have something to add to that as a social scientist?
Yeah, I think that census tract level would be very preferable, because it would allow us to at least get down to sort of immediate area level, neighborhood level characteristics of race and income and age, and that would help us narrow in a little bit more on which kinds of communities are most heavily affected. One of the problems I think with using zip code is that it might capture an entire community. Like I'm thinking about Framingham, where, the zip code, captures the entire city, but there are multiple census tracts within the city, some of which are, quite poor and quite high, have a high proportion of minorities. So, census tract level would probably be more informative. Thank you for that question. So I'll turn to another question that is in the Q&A. And, this is interesting because we didn't necessarily talk about pricing. We talked about affordability and we talked about CAP programs. And somebody's asking an even more fundamental question is, should water pricing be handled at the federal level instead of at the local level? So I think, I'm not sure, Dr. Ward or Professor Davis, if either of you want to speak to this, but we didn't necessarily get back to that prior level of question in our presentations.
I can provide some brief context for we don't necessarily, there's no one who administers or looks at a utility and says, hey, your water rate is too high. So the Environmental Protection Agency does provide sort of a guideline or best practice for what is an unaffordable rate for water. And I briefly mentioned this while I was talking. So for the EPA, if you are only looking at a water bill, if that bill is more than 2.5% of a median household income, it's considered unaffordable. If the bill includes sewer, that bumps up to 4.5% of median household income. So that's sort of a guideline that the EPA provides, but it is not enforceable. They do not enforce that guideline. So then if we were looking at, okay, who should be adjudicating water pricing, because local realities vary widely. So for example, California has major issues with drought, whereas Michigan does not. And those sort of local geographical realities will affect how they price their water. It's likely better for pricing to be handled at some local level rather than at the federal level, just to recognize those unique experiences. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have federal guidelines for when we go over a certain amount, like that percentage I mentioned before, 2.5% or 4.5%. of when a utility is getting into really unaffordable water rates. But I'll also pass off to Dr. Davis to maybe give some other context.
Sure, thanks. So I'll just add a little bit. It's not a new thing that this is administered at a very local level. This is really, back to colonial origins. And so historically, this has been water access and so on has been regulated at the local level. To change that would be, there'd be a lot of resistance, I think, from the local authorities that have had historically control over that. And it's also not unique to the United States. It's true internationally that water is typically administered at the very local level. And for the reasons that Dr. Ward said, is that there are unique issues that are faced locally around access to this natural resource that make it hard for it to be, sort of gone up to a higher level of regulation. I do think that it is some progress that the U.S. government now at least has some guidelines, even if they're not enforced, around the affordability issues, because for a while that wasn't the case. And they have built those guidelines partly around some of the standards that the United Nations has articulated about what would be an acceptable level of pricing for water in terms of people's incomes. And so, you know, there has been some progress in terms of at least providing some federal oversight and guidance, even though there could be more in that regard, short of actually federalizing water access and water affordability.
It would even just be helpful if the EPA said you got to collect data on affordability. You got to determine whether or not the town is even asking what proportion of people are having trouble paying their bills relative to the price. You know, the EPA can make recommendations in this area, but they can't require anybody at the federal level to even collect the kind of data that we've described in today's presentation. That's got to be state and local action. So there is another question that has popped up in the chat. Somebody wants to know, is there any difference in data collection between investor-owned and public utilities? I think, Kaylee, I'll ask you this question, if you've encountered this in any of the data scraping and the exhaustive data mining that you've done on Project 2.
Yeah, so right now, at least when we're looking at, for example, how they do enrollment or develop rates and things like that, there's not a huge discrepancy at the moment. That might be because we haven't dug deep enough into this. Again, none of this is necessarily publicly available data. We're having to go through each of these utilities individually, case by case, go through all of their forms, go through all of their documentation, and then sort of assess this. I will say, though, that it's clear that some utilities are able to provide more information than others directly on their website. So by that, what I mean is if I go to a utility and I go to their customer assistance page, if they have one, on their customer assistance page, for those who have what I would perceive as, you know, good tracking of this, very clearly what all of their programs are, all of the forms you need to submit, and also the type of assistance you would receive if you were able to be enrolled in that program. None of that is hidden behind some internal form or having to call the utility directly. Then there are other utilities where you go to their customer assistance page and it says, please call us. So you have much more difficulty in actually seeing, okay, do they have forms? What are the criteria listed on those forms? You know, sort of getting into data mining there. So right now I haven't seen, you know, a lot of discrepancy between investor-owned and public utilities, but it could be something that emerges later as we continue with analysis. If you have any follow-up question, please feel free to ask.
Okay. Martha, do you want to embellish anything that Dr. Ward has suggested here?
Well, I mean, I don't have haven't been doing the same data mining that she has been doing. I guess it would be interesting to know, partly because the investor-owned are profit-driven, and so you might wonder whether they might have more incentive to collect this data and use it in developing the programs that they have. You know, so it'd be interesting to see if that emerges as you're continuing the work.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Hand raised here from Sharon Harlan. Do you want to unmute and pose your question?
Sorry. Hi, I didn't realize I raised my hand, but the question is in the chat. If you want to read it and then try to answer, that'd be great. Thanks.
I actually don't see your question in the chat.
Don't see my question in
It's
the
not
chat.
in
actually,
the
hang on.
Q&A. It's in the regular chat.
There's a chat and there's a Q&A page. Sorry, I needed to right. Is there any change in the federal government thinking about how we pay for the necessary costs of abating pollution and replacing water infrastructure? Is anyone linking the increased cost problem to the increased price problem? I guess I would turf this question to Professor Davis. You seem to be a little bit more attuned to some things that are happening in the field.
Oh, I was going to put it over to you. So I'm not sure that I can, you know, I don't really work on environmental law so much. So, you know, per se. So I don't know that I can illuminate any of that.
I can take a crack at it. So just because I've been looking at people's like financial documents at these utilities, so their capital investment plans, which I call SIPs. So utilities are very aware of this connection, and they make these connections really explicit when they create their capital investment plans. And usually these SIPs are created in like 5-year batches or 10-year batches. It just depends on how much of a long view the utility is taking around generating and financing these projects. Within these documents, some utilities will specify if they're directly working with the EPA to help meet mandates that deal with, you know, addressing pollution and how that's related to water quality. Usually they ask for extensions from the EPA, or it could be the Department of whatever at the state level, whatever that department would be. Sometimes they have different names. Or what they might do is work with the state legislature to get financing for these things. But they don't necessarily work directly with the federal government, or is there things within those SIPs that indicate that there is sort of federal recognition of increasing pollution costs or having to retrofit things, and the utility having to figure out how to finance those. Or, you know, just even recognizing the fact that a lot of these mandates, while they are good for maintaining, you know, good water quality, they're largely unfeasible for utilities to actually implement in reality without some outside source of financial aid.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you, Kaylee.
All right. We are about 5 minutes before the hour here, so I think we probably have time for one more question. If anyone on the line has something further that they would either like to ask of the panel, or anything they'd like to add in terms of our collective store of knowledge around this discussion, now would be the good time.
So what can people do about this bill, supporting the bill in Massachusetts going forward? What would be helpful for different kinds of organizations and people to do?
Noelle, would you like to chime in on this? I know that you're on.
Yeah, I can add a
co-op this year.
little. Definitely like reaching out to your representatives and senators about it, and just like their emails are on their website, and you can just sort of write a brief email saying that you support the bill and would like to see it move forward. And then Martha, I don't know if you have other things to add. I know that reaching out to representatives is like very important with stuff like this.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk to the representatives that are sponsoring already, that's what they stress, is the importance of other representatives hearing from their constituents. The you know, as Noel mentioned, we have on the bill, and there are a number of civil society organizations, nonprofits that have stepped forward and said they support it. But it's kind of a hidden issue, you know, and so that's another reason that it's so important that people reach out, because otherwise it's not the kind of thing that is coming to the fore. Because the data isn't collected, people that are affected don't really realize that there's any unfairness in the system. They can't go and see that, you know, that the rates being charged, you know, citywide are unreasonable, or they can't really tell that their neighbor got a payment plan and they didn't, or that kind of thing. So without that data, it's very hard for anybody to know that this should be something that is an important priority. And so I think that's you know, the reason that it's so important that people reach out to their representatives and try to get them to sign on as co-sponsors, or to also speak with the organizations that you're part of to make sure that this becomes a priority. It's very important to seniors, very important to everybody. You know, everybody pays water bills. So, you know, this is something that should be of general concern.
Yeah, I think one of the things that when we think about reporting too, we also don't have any information really on how many people applied for assistance under CAP program and how many people actually received it, which, you know, speaks to this big question about equity. Like, are these cities, you know, not only do they have a program, yes or no, but are they managing it so they're making sure that the people who benefit are those who really truly need it the most? Or are they exercising discretion in some way that might introduce further bias into the problem of who is served and who is not? All right. I see
Oh, so
that
Noelle has put into the chat here for people that are online information about the House Committee, so you can see whether your community is represented there.
okay. All right. Well, I think that we are just about at time, and I would like to take one last effort to thank our presenters, Dr. Davis, Dr. Ward, and Noelle. I also want to thank the people who funded and sponsored this research. That we had 2 grants from the National Science Foundation. We also had assistance from the Northeastern University Provost Office. And thanks especially to all of you who are out in the community trying to work with people who are struggling to pay bills and who are trying to push forward policy changes that will lead to a more just future. Thank you very much.